Well, it's good to be back with you for another day of Bible study. My name is Kevin Young, and so grateful that you're joining us. Today, we find ourselves in the book of Ephesians, chapter 5, verses 15 through 20. And these are rather short verses, but they're also very important verses because they are beginning a bit of a long diatribe from Paul about how to live. And specifically, we're going to get into today, and especially later on, over the next few days, how to live in the house codes. And these verses have been taken out of context a lot. And these verses have also been used over the years to teach a lot of errant theology. But before we get there, just a few things to remind you of. Would love to have you be a part of this Bible study. We are throttling quickly along until the end. We are really only, 2 weeks left in the study, but we would still love to have you be a part of it. You can join us by downloading at go.christtable.today/unity, a PDF that lists all the readings. You don't have to catch up. Just join us each and every day from here on out. And I also want to encourage you that we would love to have you a part of what Christ Table is doing. Go ahead and visit that website, www.christtable.today, and find out more about who we are and how you can be a part, and specifically sign up for our email list there so that you will be aware of everything that is going on. One of those things that's going on is happening Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We're working through this book from Dr. Leonard Sweet, From Tablet to Table. You don't have to read up into chapter 5. Just get your Kindle, get your e-reading device, and download From Tablet to Table and read chapter 5, and then go to go.christtable.today/discuss at 9 p.m. Eastern, and we will be there. We'd love to have you join in and be a part of the conversation. And one of the things that I want to continue to remind us of is the author, Dr. Leonard Sweet himself, is going to be with us in just about 2.5 weeks. He's going to be with us online for one of those discussions, and it's going to be incredible. And so you are going to want to be a part of that. So why don't you join us on the journey up until that point? One more thing before we get into the Bible study, though. We have a resource box that is coming in just a couple of weeks to the attention of all of those who are regular donors to Christ Table. And so you can set that up on our website, christtable.today. There's going to be a missional gift in there. There's going to be a practical gift in there for you. There's going to be a Bible study in there for you. There's going to be a book in there for you so that you can be a part of a book study, and there will be several other things as well. We invest a lot of time and energy into these things because we want to equip you. And so the October-November box is going to be coming in a few weeks. It's absolutely free to our donors. You can't purchase one. We just send them for free to those people who are a regular part of our donors. So would you consider making us a part of your generosity plan? www.christtable.today. Well, today as we enter the book of Ephesians, I was reminded growing up of how I was always known as the guy who had absolutely no motor skills. Now, I grew up as a child in Indiana, and Indiana is known for snow, and we are bearing down right now on September. And September, October in the north is when it begins to get cold, and even some snow begins to visit itself there. Now, I can remember at least once or twice every single winter season slipping and falling on ice. Most of those times happened whenever I was getting on the bus or getting off the bus, whenever I was headed into church or headed out of church. And so almost every single time that I slipped and bit the dust or bit the ice was in front of a large group of people. And so everybody was there to see it. And it was always embarrassing. And I was always known as the guy who was not able to stand on his feet. And so I kind of essentially avoided sports through all of my childhood and early adolescence because I didn't have great motor skills. And also I just had this image of myself of not being able to have sure footing or being able to really accomplish anything. And when we come to Ephesians chapter 5 at verse 15, this is something of the image that Paul has in mind when he says, be careful how you live. the wording that he actually uses in the original Greek is wording that has to do with your feet, with where you place your feet. Be sure that you are careful with where you place your feet. Make sure that you're placing it on firm ground. He goes on to say then, don't live like fools, but instead live like those who actually are wise. You're given a choice. I'm given a choice as to who we use as a example, who is our mentor in how to live. And ultimately, unfortunately, many times we use people who are not great examples, people who have not placed their feet well, or who are not placing their feet well or placing their feet carefully as an example of how to live. And those are the type of people that we follow. If we live like a fool, then we become a fool. If we live like the wise, the Bible tells us that we become wise. Make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. Now, in the English rendering of that, we don't actually get a sense of what Paul's saying here, but Paul is saying something very specific, because the church, when he writes this, is beginning to sense that there is going to be a great wave of persecution coming their way. And what Paul is doing here is Paul is intentionally saying to them, we understand that there is a time coming, and time is a word that he actually uses here in the Greek. We understand that there is a time coming where it is going to be very difficult to place your feet well. And whenever you carefully place your feet well during a time of persecution, that's going to draw a lot of attention to you, not because you fall, but because of where you're placing your feet. So Paul says, right now, while you have the ability to do what you want, to live like you want, to follow who you want, make the most of every opportunity, because you may not always have that kind of freedom. Do not, he says in verse 17, do not act thoughtlessly, but understand what the Lord wants you to do. The opportunity to listen to Christine Kane yesterday, and she gave this great example of how we drift whenever we're not paying attention. That boats drift whenever we've not paid attention to whether or not the anchor is secure. That if we're out swimming in the ocean, that if we're not paying attention, then we end up drifting away from shore or drifting into areas that we should not be swimming in. It wasn't as though you intended to end up in a place of danger. It wasn't as though you intended to drift, but you weren't thinking, you weren't paying attention. This is the image that Paul is giving us here, is he's saying, don't act thoughtlessly, but be thoughtful. Understand what the Lord wants you to do. In short, be intentional. Maybe if I would have been more intentional growing up during those snow days in Indiana with where I placed my feet, maybe if I would have been a little bit more intentional about where I placed my feet, maybe I would have stayed on my feet more. Maybe I would have gotten a reputation for being the guy who's always going to slip and fall on the ice and hurt himself. If I'd been more careful, if I'd been more thoughtful with where I was placing my feet, on what path I was walking, it may have saved me a lot of pain. It may have saved me a lot of suffering. Verse 18, now Paul takes a very interesting turn. Don't be drunk with wine, because that will ruin your life. What an interesting statement here, almost out of nowhere. And this verse has so been ripped out of context. Thinking back on those days in Indiana, our church was a teetotaler community, independent, fundamental, Bible-believing Baptist, which meant, I guess, that other Baptists, and certainly anybody else that wasn't Baptist, weren't Bible-believing, but we were, which is why we said we were Bible-believing Baptists. And they taught that wine was wrong, that alcohol was wrong, even taught that whenever the Bible says and uses the word wine, that it meant grape juice. It's funny because there's actually a Greek word for grape juice, but it uses the word for wine. Anyway, the Bible doesn't says don't. The Bible never says don't drink. That's ridiculous. That's bad theology. In fact, it says the opposite of that. It encourages us to do the opposite of that because wine is a metaphor, a symbol of the blood and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And anyway, I know that for many of us, that's a dark hole in there. There's family history and genetics at play. And for many of us, we have to be a teetotaler, and that's okay. But God doesn't require it for all of us. But why does Paul point it out here? Why does Paul say, don't be drunk with wine because that will ruin your life? Well, we have to read it in the greater context to see essentially what Paul is saying here. And I think, one of the things that is important for us whenever we read and think about this in context is to remember that Paul isn't saying don't drink wine. What he's saying is don't get drunk. What happens when you get drunk? Well, if you get pulled over for it, you have a hard time walking a straight line, right? You have a hard time, doing the finger on the nose test, right? Oftentimes, if you've ever been in a situation, had to carry a friend out of a bar to keep him upright, to keep him from stumbling and falling and hurting themselves. And I think that what Paul is doing here is Paul is essentially leveraging this as an example of one way in which we can understand what it means to not get ourselves thoughtlessly in a situation where we're not able to place our feet well. Paul says, instead, what I want you to do is be filled with the Holy Spirit, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs among yourselves, and making music to the Lord in your hearts. So Paul is kind of using this idea of drunkenness as a juxtaposition. You have the opportunity to either be drunk with other things, and maybe the best visual image that he can give for that is wine, or you have the opportunity to really in your life be drunk in the Spirit. You have the opportunity to choose one path or the other. Either way, you're going to be filled with something that is going to inebriate you, that in the eyes of the world is going to make you seem a little crazy and a little off and a little not yourself. I think it's awesome here that he says, instead of being filled with alcohol to the extent in which you're drunk, why don't you be filled with the Spirit, with God, to the extent that you seem drunk? Because what oftentimes do drunk people do? Well, they lose their inhibitions. They sing. They're joyful. They're gleeful. Oftentimes, they're hilarious. They're fun to be around. They're the life of the party. They sing a lot. They make music. Paul says, you know what? That should be a Christian. What happens when you're drunk? That life of the party, that joy, that loss of oneself into something greater than oneself. On alcohol, that can be dangerous. But when you do that with God, that's something wholly different. So Paul's saying, you have different ways in life that you can get that way. That you can get to the point of losing yourself and being so filled with something that you've become something greater or different than yourself. Alcohol, doing that's going to lead to things that probably are going to end up being embarrassing. You're going to lose control. You're going to become a slave to that. Lose control with God instead. Become a slave to God instead. Make music and sing like you're drunk, but because you're filled with the Spirit, not with the bottle. I love in Acts chapter 2, verse 15, whenever Pentecost happens and The Spirit falls, remember the flaming tongues of fire, and everyone was speaking in tongues, and thousands of people came into Jerusalem, and they all understood each other, even though they only spoke different languages. And all the people who are watching this happen in the capital city of Jerusalem say, well, these people are just drunk. They had too much to drink during the celebration. And Peter gets up and shouts among or above all of the roar of the crowd and says, and this is, I love this verse. It's just great. Peter says, these people aren't drunk. He's talking about the folks who have been filled with the Spirit. He said, these people aren't drunk, as some of you are assuming. 9 o'clock in the morning is much too early for that. And I just love that line. It's so Peter. 9 o'clock in the morning is much too early for that. So what we see here is a couple of things, is that whenever we are truly filled with the Spirit, it looks like we're drunk. We're so happy. We're so free. We're so careless. We're joyful people to be around in that moment. That's what being filled with the Spirit looks like. That's maybe our best example of it. But all of the good parts, not all the bad parts and sad parts of being drunk. If you're going to lose yourself, there's only one thing you want to lose yourself in, and that's God. The other thing that I get out of this passage is that clearly Peter didn't have a problem with drinking. Clearly alcohol wasn't an issue in the early church. They weren't teetotalers, and of course they weren't, because Jesus wasn't. And Jesus never taught that we should be. But I love that you're assuming that these people are drunk, but 9 o'clock in the morning is much too early for that. If this were later in the day, maybe they were, maybe they are. Not here, not now. And Paul, and we're going to conclude with this, and I hope you'll join us for tomorrow, because let me tell you, this chapter only gets better and more complicated. Just wait until we get to the part where he starts talking about submission, children and parent relationships, and slavery. So I'm gonna earn my pay this week, and we're gonna see where it goes. But we're gonna close with this one right now for today. And give thanks for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Give thanks for everything to God. That persecution and that suffering that you're going through, God didn't send it your way, but give thanks to Him that you're alive, that you're hopefully learning something from this, and give thanks to God that it won't last forever, and that He's there to walk alongside you with it. Give thanks to God. Give thanks to God for whatever comes your way, and make sure that you're filled with the Spirit and not filled with other things. Because if you're filled with other things, you're probably not going to be giving thanks to God for it. So be filled with the Spirit and give thanks to God. And we'll stop there, and I will be back with you tomorrow as we jump way into the deep end of this. But if you've not already done so, hey, head over to www.christtable.today. I really want you to be a part of what God's doing here. It's incredible what's going on, and we need you. So jump on board. Sign up for the email list. I'd love to send a box your way. In fact, if you donate now, I'll send you the box from a couple of months ago, and you'll also get the October box as well. So if you're a first-time person, first time signing up for regular giving, I'll just go ahead and shoot 2 boxes your way. Well, it's been great to have you with us today. Until tomorrow, happy